floor of the garage had been poured sometime in the late 50s, and whoever did it didn't take much care with the finishing. There were low spots where oil pooled after a rain, and a long crack running diagonally from the south wall to the drain that Hazel Doucette had been meaning to patch for 2 years. She never did. There was always something more urgent. Hazel was 24 years old. She had been running Doucette and Sons Auto on the edge of Rivière-du-Loup since her father passed 18 months ago. And the Nan Sons part of the sign was a joke that had stopped being funny around the time she realized she was the only one left to keep the lights on. Her older brother Mathieu had taken a job in Fort McMurray and come home for the funeral and not much else. The sign stayed because replacing it would have cost $400 she didn't have. She was good with engines, better than good. Her father had taught her the way some fathers teach their sons, without ceremony or particular praise, just by putting a wrench in her hand and expecting her to figure things out. She had, by the time she was 17, she could diagnose a misfire by sound alone. By 20, she had rebuilt a carburetor that 3 other shops in the region had declared unrepairable. She charged what her father had charged, which was not enough, and she worked the hours he had worked, which were too many. And most mornings she unlocked the bay doors before 6, and most evenings she locked them again after dark. It was a Thursday in late September when the first one showed up. Hazel heard the bikes before she saw them. She was under a 2003 Silverado with a flashlight in her teeth and her hands on a rusted exhaust manifold when the sound rolled in from the highway. Not one engine but several, a low harmonic that she felt in her sternum before she properly heard it with her ears. She let it pass without thinking much about it. Trucks and bikes and semis moved through Rivière-du-Loup all day. She went back to the manifold. Then the sound stopped. She heard boots on concrete. She rolled out from under the truck on the creeper board and looked up. There was a man standing in the open bay door, backlit by the flat gray September light, and he was large in the way that made the door frame seem inadequate. He wore a leather vest with patches she recognized, though she made a point of not looking too closely at patches. He had a gray beard trimmed short, and his forearms were covered in ink, and he was looking at the Silverado rather than at her, the way experienced mechanics look at a vehicle when they first encounter it, reading it before committing to any judgment. "Doucette?" he said. "That's the shop," she said, getting to her feet. She wiped her hands on a rag that was already past helping. "I'm Hazel." He looked at her for a moment, not with hostility, more like a man recalibrating. "They told me to ask for Doucette," he said. "My father, he passed. I run it now." He absorbed this without comment. Then he said, "Name's Beaumont. People call me Hatch." His full name, she would learn later, was Roland Beaumont, and he was the road captain of a chapter that wore their territory across their backs with the seriousness of a land deed. He had been riding for 30 years. He had buried 2 brothers and attended the funerals of men he hadn't liked, but showed up for anyway because that was the code. He was not a man who used words carelessly, and he was not a man who showed uncertainty easily. But standing in the bay door of Doucette and Sons, he showed a small amount of it. "I've got a bike," he said. "Most people who come here do." A sound from the other bay door. She looked past him and saw 2 more riders outside, and behind them, on the apron, a trailer with a motorcycle on it that was covered in a tarp. A 1971 Harley-Davidson FX Superglide she would discover later, and it had been Roland Beaumont's most prized possession for 22 years and the source of a long ongoing argument between him and the laws of mechanical entropy. 2 other shops looked at it, Hatch said, one in Quebec City, one in Montreal. Both said the frame's bent and it's not worth the money to fix. "What do you think?" He looked at her steadily. "I think they're wrong, but I've been wrong before." She walked out to the trailer and pulled the tarp back herself. It was a beautiful bike, or it had been. The tank was painted a deep burgundy that had faded to something richer and stranger over the decades, like old wine. The chrome was pitted in places but not neglected. Someone had been caring for it, just not winning. The seat was cracked along the left seam. And the frame. She crouched and looked at the front down tubes, following the lines the way her father had shown her, not with measuring tools yet, but with her eyes, which had learned over years to see the geometry of steel the way a musician hears pitch. She didn't say anything for a while. Hatch stood behind her and his 2 companions stayed near the road, and the wind came off the St. Lawrence and moved through the bay. "When did this happen?" she asked. "What, the frame? This isn't where something hit this." A pause. 3 years ago. Truck clipped me on the highway. I walked away. Figured the bike was worse than it looked, but the other shops looked at it and saw an old bike with a complicated history and decided the math didn't work. She stood up and turned around. "That's not the same as it being unfixable." Hatch looked at her with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't skepticism. It was closer to the look a person gives when they've said something they don't fully believe, and they're startled to find someone else believes it for them. "How long?" he said. "I don't know yet. I have to get it inside and get a proper look. I need it for the run on the 14th. 3 weeks. She did the math. 3 weeks was aggressive, not impossible. She looked back at the bike, at the particular way the front end sat fractionally low on the left, a deviation that most people would never see and that she had caught in about 45 seconds. Leave it, she said. I'll call you. He handed her a card with a number on it and no name, which she found either very cautious or very old-fashioned, and she decided it was probably both. He looked at the bike one more time, the way you look at something you are accustomed to worrying about. And then he walked back to his own machine, and the three of them rode out onto the highway, and the sound faded west. Hazel stood in the bay door with the card in her hand. She went inside and made coffee. The first thing she found was the frame damage, which was real and significant, and would require a jig and a careful heat cycle, and about 30 hours of work if everything went right. She'd done similar repairs, not on a bike this old, but the principles didn't change. The second thing she found took her a day longer, and it was the thing that changed everything. She had the bike on a lift and she was going through the front end, forks, bearings, stem, when she noticed the weld on the left lower fork leg. It was a repair weld, not factory. Someone had been in there before her, had cut and re-welded, and they had done it in a way that looked correct from a distance and was dangerous from closer up. The penetration was shallow. The bead was smooth on the surface, but she ran her fingernail along it and felt the slight irregularity that told her the fusion beneath wasn't what it needed to be. On a bike doing highway speeds, with a rider who weighed what Hatch weighed, that weld was a liability, not a maybe, a certainty. She climbed down from the lift and stood very still for a moment in the middle of the shop. Here was what she knew. Someone had done this weld deliberately badly. The rest of the bike's history showed careful, attentive maintenance. Whoever had been keeping this machine alive over the years knew what they were doing. This weld was not a mistake. It was placed in the right location and finished in the right way to look acceptable under a casual inspection. And it would fail at speed under load, in a moment when failure would be catastrophic. She made herself a second coffee and sat on the stool by the workbench and thought about what she was going to do with this information. The easy thing, the thing that involved less risk to Hazel Doucette personally, was to fix what she'd been asked to fix, which was the frame, and to leave the fork leg weld for someone else to discover or not discover. She had not been hired to investigate. She had been hired to repair. She sat with that thought for about 4 minutes. Then she picked up the card Hatch had left and called the number. He answered on the second ring. Found something, she said. You need to come in. He came alone, which surprised her. She had expected the two riders from before or more. He came in a truck, a plain dark blue half-ton with a long scratch along the passenger door that had rusted at the edges over time. He walked into the bay with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the bike on the lift and then at Hazel. Show me, he said. She showed him. She pointed to the weld and explained what she was seeing and what it meant, without exaggeration and without softening. She used the right words because she had always believed that the right words were a form of respect. She said, the fork leg will fail. I don't know when, but it will. And when it does, you will go down at speed and you will not get up. Hatch stood very still while she talked. When she stopped, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that had dropped about half a register, who worked on this bike before me? I can't tell you that. I can tell you it wasn't done by accident. He looked at the weld again. His hands were still in his jacket pockets. You could have just fixed the frame, he said. Yes. Why didn't you? She thought about how to answer this. She thought about her father, who had a saying he applied to all things mechanical and most things human. If you know it's wrong, you know. There was no addendum to that. It was complete as stated. Because I knew it was wrong, she said. Hatch turned and looked at her fully for the first time since he'd come in. It was a different kind of looking than before. She had the sense that she was being evaluated by a set of criteria that had nothing to do with her skill as a mechanic and that she was passing. Fix it, he said. All of it. Whatever you need. He turned and walked back to his truck, and she heard him on the phone before he'd reached the door. His voice low and deliberate, and she went back to work. The next 3 days were not comfortable. She didn't know who had sabotaged the fork leg, and she told herself that wasn't her concern, but it was hard to unknow what she knew. People came by the shop as they always did. Local farmers with tractor parts needing fabrication. A teenager with a Civic that had made its last bad noise and needed a new transmission mount. Old Marcel Chouinard with his perpetual brakes issue on a truck he had driven since before Hazel was born. Life went on at its ordinary pace, and Hazel worked through it. And somewhere in the background of all of it, she was aware that she had put a stone in a pond, whose ripples she couldn't fully see. On the fourth morning, she came in at 5:30 before the light, and there was a man sitting on the hood of a car in the lot. He was not one of Hatch's riders. He was younger, 35 or so, in a clean jacket with no patches, and he had the look of a person who wanted to seem relaxed and wasn't. He hopped down when he saw her headlights and held up a hand in greeting. Hazel Doucette, he said. Depends, she said, which was something her father used to say and which she had inherited along with the shop. My name's Thierry Bonenfant, he said. I'm a friend of the Beaumont family. I heard you've been doing some work on Roland's bike. She had her keys in her hand and she was looking at him with the particular attention she gave to cars that didn't sound right. Something in the cadence of what he'd said. Friend of the Beaumont family. Not friend of Roland's. Not I know, Hatch. The phrasing had the shape of legitimacy without the content of it. Work's private, she said, between me and the customer. His expression shifted just slightly. Of course. Roland talks about this bike a lot. I was curious about the repair. Whether it's going as well as expected. You'd need to ask him. A pause. He looked at the shop door and then back at her. You find anything unexpected? He said. Sometimes with old bikes there are surprises. The word unexpected sat in the air between them like a stone on a drum. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what he was really asking and why he might be asking it. Lots of surprises with old bikes, she said pleasantly. Every one of them is different. He waited, and she did not fill the silence, and eventually he said it was nice to meet her and got into a beige sedan and drove north. She watched him go. She stood in the gravel of the lot for a long time after his taillights disappeared. Then she went inside, unlocked the bay, and called Hatch. What came out over the next 72 hours was not a clean story. Clean stories happen in other kinds of places. What came out was the kind of story that happens in the overlap between old loyalties and money, and the particular resentments that accumulate when one man has something another man believes should belong to him. Thierry Bonenfant was the nephew of a man named Claude Arsenault, who had been a founding member of the same chapter Roland Beaumont had ridden with for over 2 decades. Arsenault had died 3 years earlier, and the question of what he'd left behind, not financially but in terms of standing, of legacy, of a certain antique rifle, and a particular ledger that recorded old debts in both directions, had become a source of ongoing frictions between the men who remembered things differently. Roland Beaumont was a central figure in that dispute, and Roland Beaumont's Superglide, which Arsenault had always quietly resented as a symbol of the man's permanence, had been in for fork work at a shop in Trois-Rivières about 2 months before the truck had clipped him on the highway. Hazel did not know all of this when she made the call. She knew the part that was her part, that a man had come to her shop asking questions a friend would not think to ask, and that the questions had the shape of concern about what she might have found. She told Hatch about Thierry Bonenfant's visit in the same voice she had used to tell him about the weld. Factual, direct, without decoration. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Are you all right?" It was not the question she had expected. "I'm fine," she said. "I just thought you should know." "I do," he said. "Thank you." He hung up. She went back to work on the frame which was coming along, the steel responding to the jig and the heat with something that felt, on good days, like cooperation. 2 more days passed without incident. On the evening of the 11th day since Hatch had first walked into her bay, she was finishing up pulling the bike off the lift to check the stance when she heard the bikes. Not 1 or 2, many. She walked to the bay door and stood in it. They were coming from the highway, a long column of headlights in the early dark, and they turned off onto the county road that led to the shop, and they kept coming. And she stood in the light of the open bay and watched them fill the lot, and the road in front of the lot and the shoulder beyond that. They came in without noise beyond the engines, and the engines cut one by one until the last one died. And then there were perhaps 140 riders standing in the dark around Doucette and Sons Auto, with the September stars starting to come out overhead, and not one of them said anything. Hatch walked through them. He came to where Hazel was standing in the door, and he looked past her at the bike on the floor, standing now on its own wheels, the frame straight, the fork leg rebuilt, the whole machine sitting the way it was meant to sit after 22 years of fighting its own decline. "You fixed it," he said. "I fixed it." He nodded slowly. He looked at it for a long time the way a man looks at something he has almost lost. Then he turned to her. "The person who worked on the fork," he said. "He's being dealt with." She didn't ask how. That was not her part of the story. "What I want to know," Hatch said, "is what we owe you." She had thought about this. She had written up the invoice the way she wrote all her invoices. Parts at cost, labor at her standard rate, no inflation for the circumstances. She handed him the paper. He looked at it. Something moved across his face. "This is all?" he said. "That's the work," she said. He folded it and put it in his jacket. Then he looked over his shoulder at the riders in the lot, the long still row of them under the dark sky, and he looked back at her. "Your father built a good shop," he said. She felt something catch in her throat, unexpected, and she pressed it back down by looking at the bike. "He built an honest one," she said. Hatch reached into his jacket and came out with an envelope and held it out to her. She looked at it and at him. "It's not payment," he said. "Don't insult me by arguing about it." She took the envelope. Then he walked back through the riders and they parted for him. And he came to his bike, which was on a trailer again because it had not yet been ridden. And he put his hand flat on the tank the way you put your hand on something you're glad to have back. And then, in an order she didn't see established and by a signal she didn't hear, the riders started their engines, one at a time. Then another, then many. The sound built across the lot and up into the night sky over the St. Lawrence, and the headlights came on. And they moved out onto the county road in the order they had come. And Hazel stood in the bay door and watched them go until the last taillight disappeared around the bend and the sound faded to nothing. And she was alone again with the cracked concrete floor and the fluorescent lights and the smell of oil and burnt metal that had been the smell of her whole life. She stood there for a while. Then she went to the workbench and opened the envelope. She counted the money twice and set it down and looked at it. It was enough to fix the floor. It was enough to replace the sign. It was more than that, actually. Though she didn't do the rest of the math that night. That night, she just stood in the shop with the money on the bench, and the ghost of the engine sound still in her ears. And she thought about her father and his saying, and about a weld that had looked right from a distance and wrong up close, and about the particular kind of courage required to say so. The next morning, she unlocked the bay doors before 6. She had work to do.